So in this video we're going to have a look at the factors that affect energy availability within a country and also think about the impacts that energy insecurity can have on the country and the people living within a particular country. If we start with the factors that affect energy availability, you've got these four sections on your sheet to have a look at. So different categories of factors that can affect the availability of energy within a country. The first of those is physical factors. Now these are the natural things that can influence the availability of particular energy sources. So perhaps the most common three things that can affect the availability of energy are a country's geology. So the rock type within a particular area will very much influence the availability of certain resources. For example, you need a particular geology in order to have oil and gas being formed. You need the presence of volcanoes in order to harness geothermal energy. So some examples of places that benefit from their particular geology are places like the Middle East with large reserves of oil, and also places like Iceland with large reserves of geothermal energy as a result of its proximity to a plate boundary. The second one is climate. Climate can influence the availability of energy on a number of levels, maybe the amount of sunshine if we're thinking about solar energy. So places like Morocco or Spain would be a good example of places that benefit from being very sunny and therefore able to harness solar energy. But even the availability of wind, if we're thinking about wind farms, or rainfall, if we're thinking about hydroelectricity, those other factors can also come into play. The third physical factor is the relief, and by this we're talking about the shape of the land and how steep or flat it is. If we want to build a hydroelectric dam to generate electricity, then one of the things we need to do is to be able to block off the valley quite easily. So mountainous regions are quite suited to that. In the UK we could think about places like North Wales and Scotland, but further afield, countries like Norway with very steep mountainous relief with high levels of rainfall, that's ideally suited to generating hydroelectric power. The second factor that influences the availability of energy is the cost of exploitation and production. It actually does cost money for us to get fossil fuels out of the ground and to refine them into fuels or to use the certain technology that's required. As fossil fuels become more expensive to extract, maybe because their reserves are decreasing, that can mean that it becomes uneconomical, it becomes too expensive for a country to extract a particular resource, so they therefore may no longer have access to that as a fuel source. The other thing to think about as well is that as demand rises, the price goes up, and so actually it can become more affordable to extract something. Oil and natural gas are finite resources, they are limited in their supply, and therefore as those supplies start to run out, they become in higher demand and that pushes the price up. If we think about low-income countries, they might not actually be able to afford to extract or process some of the fuels or resources that they have. I've given the example here of Angola in Western Africa. Angola's got a huge abundance of crude oil, large oil reserves under the ground, but because it's a low-income country, it can't afford the technology and the expertise and the infrastructure needed to actually get that oil out of the ground and refine it into fuels that people can use. So it has to rely on other countries and large companies like Shell or BP to extract that oil for them. So the cost of actually getting that fuel out of the ground is important. The third one is technology. Now, as technology develops, that can provide new opportunities to extract resources. We've mentioned fracking before in our lessons, but fracking is a good example of where an improvement in technology, a new technology, has enabled us to access resources that we couldn't access before. So in places like the USA, that's had a big impact on their supplies of natural gas because they couldn't access them before, but they can now. The same principle can be applied to renewable energy as well. So as technology gets better, we can start to make wind turbines or solar panels that are a bit more efficient and we can access more energy as a result. The other thing that technology allows us to do is to access reserves that we couldn't access before. Fracking does that in one way, but also maybe resources that are offshore. So in the North Sea, where there are large reserves of oil and natural gas, in the past we couldn't access those. In the 1950s, 1960s, we didn't have the technology to do that. But as that technology has improved for countries like the UK, that's made a big difference to securing some of our gas reserves. So political factors are the final factor that can play a role in the availability of energy supply. So conflict is important. Places like the Middle East have historically experienced lots of different wars and conflicts, and that can disrupt the supply of energy. Perhaps if they're exporting that energy, the oil or natural gas, to another country or region, then that can be disrupted by conflict. Political disagreements can also play a role as well. I've given the example here of Russia and the Ukraine, where they have disagreed in the past over the price being paid by the Ukraine to Russia for natural gas. Russia actually decided to turn off the supplies to the Ukraine of natural gas, and that actually had then disruptions elsewhere, because some of the gas travelling through the Ukraine actually ends up in Western Europe. So in countries like the UK, France, Germany experience shortages of natural gas because Russia and the Ukraine had been in some sort of dispute. The third factor is decisions and actions taken by the government, particularly subsidies. Now, subsidies are payments made by the government to individuals or to companies to encourage them to use a particular source of energy. So in the past, the government used to give you favourable rates and pay you if you installed a wind turbine on your farm or if you had solar panels on your roof. So by doing that, that actually encouraged people to generate electricity in that form. If those subsidies are introduced, that can help to make things cheaper, but if they're cut, that can make things more expensive and put people off actually then installing those renewable technologies. So the decisions taken by governments are also quite important on a regional and national scale in terms of influencing the availability of energy supply. Okay, so in this next section, we're going to think about the impacts that energy insecurity can have on particular countries or individuals. It's worth us maybe starting by thinking about what we mean by that term, energy insecurity. Insecurity occurs because supply of energy does not meet demand. Maybe a country is not able to supply enough energy to its population to actually meet the needs and demand of that population. And this can have a number of impacts, and we're going to look at each of these impacts in turn. The first hexagon here represents exploitation in sensitive areas. So as countries become more desperate for energy resources, they look to areas for energy that they might not have exploited energy from in the past, places that maybe they considered too sensitive or too precious to actually exploit the resources from. Two good examples of that are the Arctic and also the Amazon rainforest. We're going to focus a little bit more on the Arctic with this example here, particularly places like Alaska in the USA. Alaska has large oil reserves, but in the past people were put off from exploiting them because of the concern of the impact that that could have on the ecosystem, which is very fragile in those cold regions, particularly worried about the potential damage that might occur from oil spills as a result of transporting that oil either via pipeline, which could leak, or via oil tankers, which could crash and leak oil into the ocean. So people are concerned about the actions of companies like Shell, who are quite interested in accessing some of those resources in quite fragile environments. However, we should also think about the fact that that does present an opportunity to local people. The indigenous populations of Alaska, who've maybe relied on hunting and fishing to subsist themselves, they have got an opportunity there to actually find employment in potentially a new industry. The second section that we're going to have a look at is about increasing costs. We said earlier that as energy demand increases and resources become more scarce, the cost of those resources goes up. As a result of those prices rising, that can push up the prices for individual people. Maybe their electricity bills become higher as the result of having to pay more for the natural gas or coal or oil that's used to generate the electricity. The other thing to think about with increasing costs, though, is that as we maybe look to remote areas like the Arctic, actually the costs of extracting resources in those areas can actually make it too expensive to do. So even though there might be extensive oil reserves in the Arctic or natural gas reserves, it's actually too expensive to exploit those. The third hexagon down here is looking at food production and agriculture. So a good statistic here is that food production actually uses about 30% of all of the world's energy. And we think about the growing and packaging and shipping, distribution of that food. So if energy sources are not secure, then that can actually have an effect on the availability of food, and particularly food prices. The other thing that is connected between food and energy is that some farmers have actually switched from growing food to growing fuel. So they've turned their fields away from growing crops that might feed people to growing crops that could be used for biofuels. And that presents a problem, particularly in low-income countries where there might already be issues with food security. That can actually make the problem of hunger worse for people, because it means that there's less food available as farmers switch to growing energy crops, which are maybe more lucrative in terms of earning them some money. The other thing that has an impact on food production as a result of energy insecurity is in low-income countries, a lot of people rely on fuel wood or firewood to meet their energy needs. So for cooking and heating their homes, they rely on burning wood. That takes up an awful lot of people's time. If they're having to spend time during the day going and collecting wood to use on a fire, that means that they're doing that rather than perhaps growing food or working on a farm, and therefore that in turn can also affect the availability of food. The fourth impact of energy insecurity is conflict, and that conflict can occur as there's competition between countries or within countries over who gets access to particular sources of energy. I mentioned Russia and the Ukraine earlier as an example of countries that have had disagreements. And that can have impacts because some countries can become very reliant on imports from other countries, and the UK is definitely in that category. And we could be actually impacted quite significantly if we were to have a political disagreement with another country that supplied us with energy, or even if two other countries were having some kind of disagreement or conflict, that can actually affect our energy reserves. The fifth impact then is industry. So as a result of a lack of secure energy supplies, factories and industry can't really function properly. They can't make the things that they want to make, and therefore that's going to affect the economy of a country. It can also push up the prices of particular goods because it becomes more expensive to produce those things as a result of energy costs going up. You then had to try and think of a sixth example of how energy insecurity can have an impact on people. The impact I've chosen here is to think about blackouts. So in countries with unstable sources of energy, particularly in low and newly emerging economies, they really struggle to provide consistent electricity supplies to different parts of the country, particularly in big cities. So it's not uncommon in large cities like Mumbai or Lagos in Nigeria. They would really struggle to provide electricity to everybody all day and all night. So blackouts are quite common. That can obviously affect households because in your home, if you can't turn the lights on, or you can't heat your home, or you can't cook. That's going to be disruptive. It can have impacts in hospitals because the electricity they need to run particular machinery can be disrupted. Factories might have to shut down if they don't have access to electricity. There can be traffic and transport problems. Maybe trains powered by electricity can't run, or even things like traffic lights that are powered by electricity aren't functioning, and that can cause significant problems on the roads. So in newly emerging economies where you've got a growing population all trying to demand lots of energy, if that's not being met, then blackouts can be really common. The electricity can go off for several hours at a time, and that can be really, really disruptive, not just to people's daily lives, but to the economy as well. So that covers all of the impacts of energy insecurity. Hopefully that's made some sense and that's enabled you to finish off the work that you needed to be doing.